Europe, the birthplace of combustion engine cars, now also the place where politicians are willing to bury its own car industry in a crusade against emissions. Not only has the EU decided to ban the production of new petrol and diesel cars after 2035, but in the meantime it also introduced a new emission standard called Euro 7. In this video, you will learn what Euro 7 is and what changes it brings, what is the timeline for its implementation, what are the estimated costs of the regulation, and why it may be counterproductive when it comes to emissions decrease. So what is Euro 7? Since the early 1990s, the European Union has been imposing ever stricter emissions regulations that new cars had to comply with in order to be allowed to be sold. New emission standards have been rolled out about every 5 years, and Euro 7 is the latest proposal. Unlike its predecessors, Euro 7 with all its attendant documents has grown to over 6,000 pages of highly bureaucratic language. Its aim is to achieve a lower air pollution by tightening the limits on the car emissions, such as carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, hydrocarbons or particulate matter. Euro 7 has two parts, one for personal cars and vans and second for trucks and buses. This video will focus on the regulation for cars. The regulation will bring following changes. Some of the emissions limits will be tightened. This would be demanding, but by itself not so problematic. The problem is that the limits would actually have to be achieved. You see, in the previous standards, the emissions were mostly tested in a lab, that is, under artificial conditions. The experts knew that the emissions during real driving would be higher than those achieved in the lab. For this reason, Euro 7 puts more emphasis on RDE, real driving emissions testing. This means that the cars will need to comply with the regulation while actually driving on the road. Moreover, under Euro 7, the cars will have to comply under more extreme conditions which were previously excluded from the measurement, such as very high or very low temperature, high altitude, etc. The new regulation requires the car to remain compliant for 10 years or 200,000 kilometers, doubling the previous requirement of 5 years or 100,000 kilometers. Another change is inclusion of short trips into the measurement. The main component responsible for decreasing exhaust pollutants is a catalytic converter, or CAT. Through a chemical reaction, it decreases the amount of harmful particles released by the car. But the catalyst needs to be heated by the engine to almost 400 degrees Celsius to work properly. That takes several minutes. This is why in the first few minutes after start, the car emits multiple times as many emissions. In order to be Euro 7 compliant during short drives, the new cars will need to have electrical heating of the CAT in order to activate the catalytic reaction much faster. One particularly stringent innovation of the Euro 7 regulation is onboard monitoring, or OBM. It requires installing a large number of sensors that will calculate the car's emission in real time. The sensors will gather information not only from the engine system, but also from all systems that could indirectly influence the emissions, such as air conditioning or heated windows. This has severe implications. Not only do the cars need to achieve super low emissions, they have to adhere to the limits all the time. In the current system, the cars are tested after manufacturing and then during the periodic technical inspection. Under Euro 7, the car will be under constant emissions surveillance. If the car emissions exceed the limit in several consecutive trips, you will get a warning. If you do not get the emissions back within the limit in several more trips, the car will simply shut down and will not be able to drive. The current onboard diagnostic will give you a warning only if there is a significant malfunction of a specific car part. The new onboard monitoring may not even tell you what's wrong with the car, it will just tell you that your emissions are too high. What if there is not a single significant malfunction, but several systems are slightly underperforming and together cause the transgression of the limits? What does it imply? Will you have to replace half of your entire car? And what if the emissions are a result of your driving style or abnormal conditions, or just a malfunction of the sensors? You may not even find out. There is a lot of uncertainty surrounding this issue. For the very first time, Euro 7 also intends to measure and regulate emissions from brakes and tires. You see, there are emissions released by the friction between the brakes and the discs, or between the tires and the road. These emissions will have to be decreased. However, brakes and tires are important for safety, so the challenge will be decreasing the emissions without negatively impacting their safety and durability. I have to ask you for a favor. I put a lot of effort into these videos. If you feel that I deserve it, please consider subscribing to this channel and hit the like button. Let's look at the intended timeline for implementation. Apart from the stringency itself, the car industry's main complaint is the time schedule. Euro 7 proposal has been published in November 22. It should come into effect in July 25, so basically in 2.5 years. The manufacturers say that the development of next generation technology typically takes around 5 years. Not only that, the proposal itself was very incomplete. For example, there is not a specified methodology for measurement of tire emissions, or a list of emissions which will have to be measured by onboard monitoring, and the list goes on. Many of those instructions have still not been provided so far in summer 2023. Therefore, the R&D teams are supposed to work on very unclear requirements. Given all of these changes, how will the Euro 7 affect the price of new cars? Let's summarize the likely innovations and additions. The new cars will have to have overall more optimized powertrain system, more expensive catalytic converter, electrical heating for the catalytic converter, which will also likely require overhaul of the entire electric system of the car, large increase in the number of sensors, more expensive sensors because they need to be more accurate and durable, more powerful car computer in order to be able to process the additional data, new software security, which is an additional requirement of the Euro 7 for cybersecurity, and also more expensive tires and brakes and more. What are the specific cost estimates for these changes? Well, the European Commission estimates that it will make the new cars more expensive by about 200 euros for petrol and 400 euros for diesel cars. This shows how naively optimistic the European Commission is. A study commissioned by ACEA, the Car Industry Association, estimates the cost increase at around 2,000 euros per car. We should take this also with a grain of salt, but even if the true costs are somewhere in the middle, it is still significant. And remember, it's not only about the cost of new cars. Because of the onboard monitoring, the cost of service will likely increase too. It is important to say that a separate EU regulation is constantly tightening the CO2 limits for cars, which can be achieved by better mileage. This additional regulation might result in a complete phase-out of manual transmission in favor of automatic transmission cars, because the automats are slightly more fuel efficient. The Americans might not understand this, but having manual transmission is an effective way to cut the price, especially in low-end cars. The market price difference today is around 2,000 euros. Put together, cars in Europe will likely become much more expensive in the near future. This brings us to the last point, which is that the regulation might be counterproductive for its own aim. The current new cars, compliant with Euro 6, are already very clean. Upgrading from Euro 6 to Euro 7 will have very limited benefit. On the other hand, very old cars are dirty as f***. That is the problem. This graph shows the average age of the car park in individual European countries. The average age has been steadily increasing for many years. This is especially problematic in the Eastern European countries, where the average car is 15 years old, meaning half of them are even older. These cars were made under Euro 4, Euro 3 or even older emission standards. Not only were those cars much more polluting even when they were new, but when they are already worn down, they are even worse. One such car emits dozens of times more particles than the current Euro 6 cars. The real solution would be to replace them for newer ones. But as you have seen, the new regulations are making the cars more expensive and therefore less affordable. And who is generally driving the very old cars? People with lower income. Let's do some math. The net median income in Eastern European countries is around 1,000 euros per month. The bottom half is typically not able to save much more than 10% of their income. If the car price increases by 1,000 or 2,000 euros, it can mean 1 or 2 additional years worth of saving. If an expensive car goes from 50 to 52,000, it's not a big deal, but if a cheap model goes from 10 to 12, it will keep the dirty old cars on the road for much longer. That is why the car industry claims that under such conditions, the cheaper models will no longer be marketable. That is the worst case scenario for the air pollution issue. Another reason why it may be counterproductive is that it takes away the brainpower and resources from electric vehicle development. Since the EU banned the sale of fossil fuel cars from 2035 onward, people thought that the industry will at least have free space to prepare for the transition to electric vehicles, where Europe already stagnates behind USA and East Asia. In total, the new regulation will deal a double blow to the European car industry. It will force the cars to be more expensive, causing a decrease in sales. Lower sales and lower profit means less money for development. And at the same time, it will take away some of the R&D resources from electric vehicle development, worsening the already noticeable lag behind the global competition. This is really bad news for Central European countries, where the automobile industry is the most important source of GDP and employment. That is why those countries raised hard opposition to this new regulation. Shortly before publishing this video, those countries succeeded and achieved a significant amendment to Euro 7. The new proposal is more lenient, and crucially, it gives more time to the industry. The new limits will likely not be applicable before 2027. But the European Parliament still has to approve the new version. So the battle is far from over.